Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Vincent Reeves had built his life on three pillars: his construction empire, his family, and his unshakable belief that loyalty was everything. At 42, he commanded respect from every corner of Detroit's construction industry. His company, Reeves Foundation, had risen from nothing, just like Vincent himself, who'd clawed his way up from the foster care system with nothing but his fists and an iron will. The sprawling mansion in Bloomfield Hills stood as testament to his success. Vincent had designed every detail himself, from the reinforced concrete foundations to the hidden security system that would make a paranoid dictator jealous. He'd built it for his family, his wife Brooke, and their 8-year-old daughter Emma. Brooke Patterson had been a sociology professor at Wayne State when they met 12 years ago. Vincent was guest lecturing about his unconventional path to success, and she'd challenged every word he said with her sharp intellect and fierce green eyes. She came from old money, the kind that looked down on new money like Vincent's. Her parents had disowned her when she married him, calling him blue-collar trash with delusions of grandeur. Vincent had never forgotten that phrase. He never forgot anything. Their marriage had been passionate in the beginning. Brooke was fascinated by his raw ambition, and Vincent was captivated by her refinement. But as his empire grew, the cracks began to show. Brooke resented his long hours, his brutal business tactics, his inability to simply relax. She wanted intellectual conversations about literature and philosophy. He wanted to discuss expansion plans and competitor weaknesses. The first real fracture came when Emma was born. Vincent had hoped for a son to carry on his legacy, but Emma was perfect, a beautiful blend of his determination and Brooke's intelligence. However, Brooke's postpartum depression had been severe, and Vincent, in his typical fashion, had tried to fix it with money and solutions rather than understanding. "You think everything can be solved with your checkbook," Brooke had screamed during one of their fights. "But you can't buy emotional intimacy, Vincent. You can't construct a marriage like one of your buildings." Vincent had thrown himself deeper into work, expanding Reeves Foundation across 3 states. He told himself he was building security for his family, but the truth was simpler. He understood concrete and steel better than he understood human hearts. The warning signs had been there for months. Brooke's late nights at faculty meetings, her new interest in fitness and fashion, the way she'd started putting her phone face down during dinner. But Vincent had been too focused on acquiring his biggest competitor, Morrison Construction, to pay attention. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd been so busy building his empire that he'd let his own foundation crumble. Dr. Troy Hendricks had been Emma's pediatrician since birth. Tall, prematurely gray, with the kind of bedside manner that made mothers trust him completely. He'd gone to medical school on a scholarship, worked his way through residency at Children's Hospital, and built a practice that was the gold standard for pediatric care in the Detroit area. Vincent had actually liked Troy initially. The man seemed dedicated to his work, never tried to upsell unnecessary treatments, and had a genuine way with Emma that made her feel safe during visits. Troy had been divorced for 3 years. His ex-wife had left him for a pharmaceutical sales rep, taking their teenage son to California. Some people just aren't built for the long haul, Troy had confided to Vincent during one of Emma's appointments. They want the easy life, not the meaningful one. Vincent had nodded in agreement, never suspecting that Troy was already planning to steal his wife. The affair had begun, as these things often do, with emotional intimacy. Brooke had started taking Emma to more frequent checkups, claiming she was worried about the child's recurring headaches. Troy had been understanding, sympathetic, a stark contrast to Vincent's "just give her some aspirin and she'll be fine" approach. Late-night phone calls about Emma's condition had evolved into discussions about Brooke's marriage problems. Troy had been the perfect listener, professional, caring, available. He'd validated all of Brooke's frustrations about Vincent's emotional distance, his workaholic tendencies, his inability to communicate on her level. "You deserve better than this," Troy had told her during one of their coffee meetings. "You're an incredible woman, and you're withering away in that mansion. The physical affair had started 6 months ago, during a medical conference in Chicago that Brooke had accompanied Troy to under the pretense of research for a paper she was writing on childhood trauma. Vincent had been in Phoenix, closing the Morrison deal, when his wife had first betrayed their marriage vows. What Vincent didn't know yet was that Brooke and Troy had been planning their exit strategy for weeks. They'd found a house in Portland, Oregon, where Troy had been offered a position at a prestigious children's hospital. They'd opened joint bank accounts, made arrangements for Emma's school transfer, and even consulted with a lawyer about the best way to maximize Brooke's divorce settlement. But first, they needed to neutralize Vincent's inevitable retaliation. The plan was simple: make Vincent look like an unfit father. Document his anger, his controlling behavior, his obsession with work over family. Brooke had been secretly recording their arguments, saving his harshest text messages, building a case that would paint him as emotionally abusive. The final piece was the most cruel. They would use Emma as bait. Chapter 2. The Trap Springs. Emma's illness had started innocuously enough. A fever, some nausea, complaints of dizziness. Brooke had rushed her to Troy's office, where he diagnosed a severe case of strep throat that had progressed to scarlet fever. The treatment required strong antibiotics and careful monitoring. "I'm worried about complications," Troy had told Brooke privately. "Scarlet fever can affect the heart, the kidneys. Emma needs constant care." What Vincent didn't know was that Troy had been gradually increasing Emma's medication doses, creating symptoms that mimicked a worsening condition. The child wasn't getting better because she was being slowly poisoned by the very man who was supposed to heal her. Brooke had played her part perfectly, becoming the devoted mother nursing her sick child while Vincent worked. She documented every moment of his absence, every time he'd chosen a business call over reading Emma a bedtime story. "Look at this," she'd whispered to Troy during one of their secret meetings. "He hasn't even asked about her temperature today. He's more concerned about his quarterly projections than his own daughter." The trap was set for a Tuesday evening in October. Vincent had been on a conference call with investors in Tokyo, dealing with a complex zoning issue that could make or break his expansion into the Asian market. Emma had been crying in her room, calling for her daddy, but Vincent had been too deep in negotiations to break away. Brooke had waited until his call was over, then confronted him in his study with Emma in her arms. The child was pale, shivering, clearly in distress. "She's been asking for you for 2 hours," Brooke had said, her voice carefully modulated to convey just the right amount of accusation. "2 hours, Vincent, while you were talking about profit margins." "I was working," Vincent had replied, his tone defensive. "That deal could set Emma up for life. What good is financial security if she doesn't have a father who gives a damn about her?" The argument had escalated quickly. Vincent had accused Brooke of being dramatic, of coddling Emma. Brooke had accused him of being a cold, heartless bastard who cared more about money than his family. "Maybe if you actually paid attention to your daughter instead of just writing checks, you know how sick she really is," Brooke had spat. That's when Vincent had made his fatal mistake. Frustrated, exhausted from weeks of 18-hour days, he'd snapped back. "Maybe if you weren't so damn weak, you could handle a sick kid without falling apart." The words had hung in the air like poison. Emma had started crying harder, and Brooke's face had gone white with fury. "Weak," she'd whispered. "I'll show you weak." She'd stormed out of his study, Emma still in her arms, and Vincent had heard the kitchen door slam. He'd assumed she was going to make Emma some soup or tea, something to help the child feel better. Instead, Brooke had taken the kettle of boiling water she'd prepared earlier and, in full view of the hidden camera Troy had installed in the kitchen, poured it over Emma's head. "This will toughen you up," she'd said, her voice loud enough to be clearly recorded. "Your father thinks we're weak. Let's show him what strong looks like." Emma's screams had brought Vincent running, but by then, Brooke had already called 911, claiming that Vincent had scalded their daughter in a fit of rage. The burns were severe, but not life-threatening. Troy had calculated the temperature and volume precisely to cause maximum pain with minimal permanent damage. "He's been under so much stress," Brooke had sobbed to the paramedics. "He's been drinking more, staying up all night, screaming at Emma when she cries. I've been afraid to leave her alone with him." Vincent had been arrested at the hospital while Emma was being treated. The evidence seemed overwhelming. A recording of him calling his wife weak, his own admission that he'd been frustrated with Emma's illness, and Brooke's tearful testimony about his increasingly erratic behavior. The charges were attempted child abuse, reckless endangerment, and domestic violence. Vincent's lawyer, George Kellerman, had been blunt about the situation. "They have you cold, Vince. Audio recording, physical evidence, credible witness testimony. You're looking at 5 to 10 years minimum, and you'll never see Emma again." But Vincent had been in tight spots before. Growing up in foster care had taught him that the system was rigged against people like him, that the only way to survive was to be smarter, more ruthless, more willing to cross lines than your enemies. He'd made bail using his company as collateral, but the damage was done. The story had hit the news. Construction mogul accused of scalding daughter, and Vincent had watched his empire begin to crack. Clients were pulling contracts, investors were asking questions, and his board of directors was demanding his immediate resignation. Brooke had filed for divorce and emergency custody, painting herself as the heroic mother who'd finally found the courage to protect her child from her abusive husband. She'd moved in with her mother in Troy's neighborhood, beginning their new life together while Vincent's old life disintegrated. What Brooke and Troy didn't know was that Vincent had been recording everything too. Chapter 3: The Hunter's Patience. Vincent had learned long ago that the best revenge was the kind your enemies never saw coming. While Brooke and Troy celebrated their victory, believing they'd successfully destroyed him, Vincent had been quietly building his counterstrike. The first step was proving his innocence, but that would come later. First, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. Vincent's security consultant, Riley Torino, was a former FBI agent who'd been forced out of the bureau for being too creative with surveillance techniques. Riley specialized in the kind of digital detective work that existed in legal gray areas, the kind that could never be used in court but could give Vincent the intelligence he needed. "Your wife's been planning this for months," Riley had reported during their first meeting. "Bank accounts, phone records, travel arrangements. She's been busy. But she's also been sloppy." The evidence was damning. Text messages between Brooke and Troy discussing their timeline, financial records showing Troy's payments for the Portland house, and most importantly, receipts for the spy camera equipment Troy had installed in Vincent's home. "They've been recording you for 6 weeks, Riley continued. "Every argument, every moment of frustration, every time you prioritized work over family time. They built a highlight reel of you being a typical stressed-out businessman and sold it as evidence of abuse." But Vincent's most valuable discovery was Troy's medical records. The good doctor had been prescribing medications to Emma that were completely inappropriate for her actual condition. The dosages were subtly increasing, designed to create dependency and worsen her symptoms. "He's been making your daughter sick to strengthen their case," Riley had explained. "Classic Munchausen by proxy, except he's doing it to frame you instead of getting attention." Vincent had felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd always been capable of violence. Growing up in foster care had required it, but he'd channeled that darkness into business success. Now, for the first time in years, he felt the old rage awakening. "I want them destroyed," he'd told Riley. "Not just embarrassed or inconvenienced. I want them to lose everything they care about." "That's going to require patience," Riley had warned. "If we move too fast, it'll look like retaliation. We need to be smarter than they are." Vincent had agreed to wait, but waiting didn't mean sitting idle. He'd begun mapping out Brooke and Troy's weaknesses, studying their routines, identifying pressure points that could be exploited. Troy's ex-wife, Deborah, lived in Los Angeles with their 16-year-old son, Marcus. The divorce had been bitter, with Troy owing significant back alimony and child support. Deborah had been trying to collect for years, but Troy had been hiding assets and claiming financial hardship. "He's been crying poverty while funding his affair with your wife," Riley had discovered. "Portland house, European vacation, jewelry for Brooke. He's been spending money hand over fist while claiming he can't afford child support." Brooke's mother, Patricia Patterson, was a different kind of vulnerability. The woman had been horrified by her daughter's marriage to Vincent, but she'd been even more horrified by the public scandal. Patricia cared about social standing above all else, and having a daughter accused of adultery while her son-in-law faced child abuse charges was devastating to her carefully cultivated image. She's been fielding calls from the country club set, Riley had reported. Lots of whispered conversations about her daughter's situation. She's more concerned about her bridge club than her granddaughter's welfare. But Vincent's most dangerous discovery was about Troy himself. The man wasn't just a cheating doctor. He was a predator with a pattern. He's done this before, Riley had revealed during their third meeting. Different city, different victim, but the same playbook. There was a case in Cleveland 5 years ago. Married patient, custody battle, suspicious medical records. The husband ended up losing everything, but he died in a car accident before he could appeal. Accident? Vincent had asked. Break failure. Very convenient timing. Vincent had felt the pieces clicking into place. Troy wasn't just stealing his wife and daughter. He was planning to eliminate Vincent entirely. The criminal charges were just the first step. If Vincent somehow beat the case, there would be other problems. Financial irregularities, tax issues, maybe even a tragic accident like the one in Cleveland. They're not just destroying your reputation, Riley had concluded. They're setting you up for permanent removal. That night, Vincent had stood in his empty mansion, looking out at the grounds he'd so carefully designed. Every security camera, every reinforced door, every hidden passage. He'd built this place to be impregnable. But the real threat had been living inside with him all along. He'd pulled out his phone and made a call to an old friend from his foster care days. Tommy Breslin had gone a different route than Vincent. Instead of channeling his anger into business, he'd channeled it into becoming one of Detroit's most effective problem solvers. Tommy specialized in situations where the legal system couldn't or wouldn't provide justice. Vince fucking Reeves, Tommy had laughed when he'd answered. I heard about your troubles. You finally ready to get your hands dirty again. I need information, Vincent had said. And I need options. Information I can get you. Options depend on how far you're willing to go. Vincent had looked at the family photo on his desk. Him, Brooke, and Emma at last year's Christmas morning. Emma was smiling, holding the custom dollhouse he'd built for her. Brooke was looking at her phone, already planning her betrayal. No limits, Vincent had said. They wanted to see what I'm really capable of. Let's show them. He's been crying poverty while funding his affair with your wife, Riley had discovered. Portland house, European vacation, jewelry for Brooke. He's been spending money hand over fist while claiming he can't afford child support. Brooke's mother, Patricia Patterson, was a different kind of vulnerability. The woman had been horrified by her daughter's marriage to Vincent, but she'd been even more horrified by the public scandal. Patricia cared about social standing above all else, and having a daughter accused of adultery while her son-in-law faced child abuse charges was devastating to her carefully cultivated image. She's been fielding calls from a country club set, Riley had reported. Lots of whispered conversations about her daughter's situation. She's more concerned about her bridge club than her granddaughter's welfare. But Vincent's most dangerous discovery was about Troy himself. The man wasn't just a cheating doctor. He was a predator with a pattern. He's done this before, Riley had revealed during their third meeting. Different city, different victim, but the same playbook. There was a case in Cleveland 5 years ago. Married patient, custody battle, suspicious medical records. The husband ended up losing everything, but he died in a car accident before he could appeal. Accident? Vincent had asked. Break failure. Very convenient timing. Vincent had felt the pieces clicking into place. Troy wasn't just stealing his wife and daughter. He was planning to eliminate Vincent entirely. The criminal charges were just the first step. If Vincent somehow beat the case, there would be other problems. Financial irregularities, tax issues, maybe even a tragic accident like the one in Cleveland. They're not just destroying your reputation, Riley had concluded. They're setting you up for permanent removal. That night, Vincent had stood in his empty mansion, looking out at the grounds he'd so carefully designed. Every security camera, every reinforced door, every hidden passage. He'd built this place to be impregnable. But the real threat had been living inside with him all along. He'd pulled out his phone and made a call to an old friend from his foster care days. Tommy Breslin had gone a different route than Vincent. Instead of channeling his anger into business, he'd channeled it into becoming one of Detroit's most effective problem solvers. Tommy specialized in situations where the legal system couldn't or wouldn't provide justice. Vince fucking Reeves, Tommy had laughed when he'd answered. I heard about your troubles. You finally ready to get your hands dirty again. I need information, Vincent had said. And I need options. Information I can get you. Options depend on how far you're willing to go. Vincent had looked at the family photo on his desk. Him, Brooke, and Emma at last year's Christmas morning. Emma was smiling, holding the custom dollhouse he'd built for her. Brooke was looking at her phone, already planning her betrayal. No limits, Vincent had said. They wanted to see what I'm really capable of? Let's show them. The hunter had been patient long enough. Now, it was time to set traps of his own. Chapter 4. The Serpent's Nest. Vincent's plan began with understanding his enemy's psychology. Brooke and Troy believed they were the intelligent ones, the sophisticated ones, the ones who'd outsmarted the brutal construction worker. They'd underestimated Vincent's capacity for strategic thinking, mistaking his direct approach to business for simple-mindedness. Their first mistake was assuming Vincent would react predictably. They expected him to rage, to threaten, to make the kind of mistakes that would strengthen their case against him. Instead, Vincent had become a ghost, disappearing into the shadows while his enemies celebrated their apparent victory. The second mistake was believing they were safe in their new life together. Brooke had moved into Patricia's guest house, a converted carriage house behind the main mansion in Grosse Pointe. Troy had been spending his nights there, playing house with Brooke and Emma while maintaining his medical practice. Vincent's surveillance team had been watching them for weeks, documenting their routines, their vulnerabilities, their moments of weakness. What they discovered was that success had made Brooke and Troy careless. They'd been seen together in public, holding hands at restaurants, kissing in parking lots, acting like a couple instead of a doctor and his patient's mother. They'd left digital footprints everywhere, joint credit cards, shared streaming accounts, hotel reservations from their affair period that dated back months before Vincent's arrest. They're not covering their tracks, Riley had reported. They think they've won, so they're getting sloppy. But Vincent wasn't interested in simply exposing their affair. That would only result in a messy divorce and shared custody. He wanted total victory, Emma back in his arms, his enemies destroyed, and his reputation restored. The plan required multiple moving parts, each one carefully timed to create maximum chaos. First, Vincent needed to neutralize the criminal charges against him. Riley had been working with a team of specialists to analyze the kitchen footage, and they'd found something interesting. The camera angle is wrong, the video expert had explained. Troy positioned it to show you entering the kitchen, but it also shows the counter where your wife prepared the boiling water. Look at the timestamp. She filled that kettle 20 minutes before your argument even started. The evidence was subtle but damning. Brooke had been preparing to scald Emma before Vincent had even said anything about her being weak. The entire scene had been choreographed, waiting only for Vincent to provide the emotional context they needed. This proves premeditation, George Kellerman had said when Vincent showed him the analysis. Your wife was planning this regardless of what you said or did. It's a setup, clear and simple. But proving innocence was only the first step. Vincent wanted his enemies to experience the same terror, the same helplessness, the same complete destruction of everything they cared about. The second phase targeted Troy's professional reputation. Vincent had Tommy's contacts dig deeper into Troy's past, and they'd uncovered a pattern of inappropriate relationships with patients' mothers. 3 different women in 3 different cities, all of them married, all of them going through difficult times with their children's health issues. He's a predator, Tommy had reported. He finds vulnerable women, gains their trust through their kids, then moves in for the kill. Your wife is just his latest mark. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records showing unnecessary treatments, suspicious prescriptions, and in one case, a mother who died from an overdose of medication Troy had prescribed for her anxiety while he'd been sleeping with her. We can't prove he killed her, Tommy had continued, but we can prove he's been systematically abusing his position to prey on vulnerable women. Vincent had felt the cold rage building in his chest. Emma had been a victim too, poisoned by a man who'd sworn to protect children. The thought of Troy's hands on his daughter, pretending to examine her while slowly making her sicker, made Vincent want to do things that would require a very deep hole in a very remote location. But patience was key. Vincent had learned that lesson in foster care, where the kids who survived were the ones who could wait for the perfect moment to strike back. The third phase was the most personal. Vincent had discovered that Brooke's betrayal went deeper than just adultery. She'd been planning to take Emma and disappear entirely, using false identities that Troy had helped her obtain. Medical records had been altered to show Emma had a rare condition that required treatment from a specific specialist, a specialist who happened to be Troy's colleague in a private clinic in Costa Rica. They were going to vanish, Riley had explained. New names, new identities, new lives. You'd have spent years looking for a daughter who officially didn't exist anymore. The plan was elaborate and expensive, funded by money Brooke had been systematically stealing from Vincent's accounts. Small amounts, spread across multiple withdrawals, disguised as household expenses and charitable donations. She's been robbing you blind for 18 months, Tommy had reported. Over $200,000, all of it funding her escape plan. Vincent had stared at the financial records, seeing his wife's betrayal laid out in spreadsheet form. Every family dinner where she'd complained about his work schedule, she'd been planning to steal his daughter. Every night, she'd kissed him goodbye. She'd been counting down the days until she could disappear forever. The fourth phase was the most dangerous. Vincent had learned that Troy had been researching Vincent's business practices, looking for anything that could be used to extend the criminal charges or create civil liability. Troy had been trying to find evidence of construction violations, tax evasion, anything that could keep Vincent tied up in legal proceedings for years. He's been talking to your competitors, Riley had discovered. Morrison Construction, specifically. They've been feeding him information about your business practices, hoping to create a scandal that would force you to sell your company at a discount. Vincent had felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. This wasn't just about stealing his wife and daughter. It was about destroying his entire life's work. Brooke and Troy had been working with Vincent's business enemies to create a complete takedown. They want everything, Vincent had told Tommy during their final planning meeting. My family, my company, my freedom. They want to erase me completely. So what do you want to do about it? Tommy had asked. Vincent had looked out the window of the abandoned warehouse where they'd been meeting. In the distance, he could see the Detroit skyline, including the Reeves Foundation building that bore his name. He'd built that from nothing, just like he'd built everything else in his life. I want them to understand what happens when you try to destroy Vincent Reeves, he'd said. I want them to learn that some people fight back. And if they don't survive the lesson, Vincent had smiled, and for the first time in months, it had felt genuine. Then they'll serve as an example to anyone else who might be thinking about crossing me. Chapter 5. The Pieces Move. Vincent's counterattack began at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, just as Troy was arriving at his medical practice. The timing was precise, early enough to catch him alone, late enough that the morning news crews would be in position to capture everything. The first wave came from a Michigan State Medical Board, armed with evidence of Troy's pattern of inappropriate relationships with patients' mothers. Riley's team had presented them with a comprehensive case file, complete with witness statements from 3 different cities, financial records showing Troy's undisclosed income, and most damning of all, Emma's medical records showing the systematic poisoning. Dr. Hendricks, you're under arrest for medical malpractice, prescription fraud, and child endangerment, Detective Carol Pappas had announced as Troy tried to enter his office. The arrest was a carefully orchestrated media event. Vincent had tipped off every news outlet in Detroit, and the footage of Troy being led away in handcuffs was playing on every morning show within hours. But Vincent wasn't finished. As Troy was being processed, the second wave hit Brooke. The Financial Crimes Unit had received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in several of Vincent's accounts. When they investigated, they'd found a clear pattern of theft stretching back 18 months. Brooke had been careful, but not careful enough. Every withdrawal was traceable to her personal accounts, and the paper trail led directly to her escape fund. Mrs. Reeves, you're under arrest for embezzlement, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Detective Mike Russo had said as Brooke was dragged out of her mother's house in front of the morning dog walkers and tennis players of Grosse Pointe. Patricia Patterson had been screaming about her daughter's innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. Brooke had been caught red-handed with money that didn't belong to her, and her elaborate escape plan made her look like a criminal mastermind rather than a victim. Vincent had watched the arrest from his lawyer's office, feeling a satisfaction he hadn't experienced since the day he'd signed his first major construction contract. But this was only the beginning. The real punishment was just getting started. Phase 2 began that afternoon. Vincent had always believed that if you were going to destroy someone, you had to be thorough. Half measures led to comebacks, and Vincent never wanted to see these people again. Tommy's contacts had been busy spreading the word about Troy's predatory behavior. Every parent in his patient database received an anonymous tip about the doctor's arrest, complete with details about his pattern of abuse. The medical practice that had taken Troy 15 years to build was destroyed within hours. Phones haven't stopped ringing, Tommy had reported. Patients canceling appointments, parents threatening lawsuits, medical suppliers cutting ties. His practice is finished. Brooke's reputation was getting similar treatment. Vincent had hired a team of digital specialists to ensure that anyone who searched for Brooke Patterson or Brooke Reeves would find the arrest footage, the financial crimes evidence, and detailed speculation about her role in the child abuse scandal. She'll never work in academia again, Riley had confirmed. No university will touch her with this kind of scandal attached to her name. But Vincent's most satisfying victory was yet to come. Emma had been placed in emergency custody with children's services pending the resolution of the criminal cases. But Vincent's legal team had been working overtime to prove his innocence and secure her return. The evidence was overwhelming. The video analysis showing Brooke's premeditation, the medical records proving Troy's systematic poisoning of Emma, and the financial records showing the elaborate conspiracy to frame Vincent and steal his daughter. They're going to drop all charges against you, George Kellerman had announced. The prosecutor wants to make a deal. Full immunity in exchange for your testimony against your wife and her accomplice. Vincent had agreed, but only after securing guarantees that Brooke and Troy would face the maximum possible sentences. He wanted them to spend years in prison, thinking about what they'd done to his family. The third phase was more personal. Vincent had decided that prison wasn't enough punishment for people who tried to steal his daughter. They needed to understand what real loss felt like. Troy's ex-wife Deborah had been very interested to learn about her ex-husband's hidden assets. With Riley's help, she'd filed for immediate seizure of all Troy's property to satisfy his outstanding child support obligations. The Portland house, the European vacation fund, even Troy's medical equipment. Everything was being liquidated to pay for his years of financial abandonment. He's going to come out of prison with nothing, Tommy had reported. No money, no career, no prospects. His own son won't even speak to him anymore. Brooke's punishment was more psychological. Vincent had always known that his wife's greatest fear was losing her social standing, and he made sure that everyone in her privileged world knew exactly what she'd done. Patricia Patterson's bridge club, her country club, her charitable organizations, they'd all received detailed information about Brooke's crimes. The woman who'd once looked down on Vincent as blue-collar trash was now a social pariah, her daughter's scandal reflecting on her own reputation. She's been kicked out of everything, Riley had reported. Country club, hospital board, even her book club. The Grosse Pointe set doesn't forgive this kind of behavior. But Vincent's cruelest stroke was yet to come. He discovered that Brooke had been telling everyone that she was the victim in the situation, that Vincent had been abusive and controlling, that she'd only been trying to protect Emma. Vincent had decided to let her keep telling that story, right up until the moment when the truth destroyed her completely. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. The trial was a massacre. Vincent sat in the gallery, watching his wife and her lover face the consequences of their actions, and felt the same cold satisfaction he'd experienced when demolishing a competitor's building to make room for his own construction. Brooke had hired the best defense attorney money could buy. Ironic, since she'd spent the last of her stolen funds to pay for representation. The lawyer, Bradley Hoffman, had tried to maintain the abuse narrative, painting Brooke as a battered woman who'd been forced to desperate measures to protect her child. My client was living in fear, Hoffman had argued. Vincent Reeves is a violent man with a history of intimidation and control. Brooke Patterson was trying to save her daughter from a dangerous situation. But Vincent's evidence was overwhelming. The video analysis showing premeditation, the medical records proving Emma's systematic poisoning, the financial records showing the elaborate conspiracy. Most damning of all was the testimony from Troy's previous victims, women who'd been seduced and abandoned by the predatory doctor. He told me my son needed experimental treatments, testified Maria Santos, a mother from Cleveland whose child had been one of Troy's victims. He said only he could save him, but he needed me to trust him completely. The treatments made my son sicker, but Dr. Hendricks said that was normal. I didn't realize until later that he'd been poisoning my child to keep me dependent on him. Troy's defense had collapsed completely when the prosecution introduced evidence of his research into Vincent's business practices. The conspiracy to destroy Vincent's company, coordinated with his competitors, proved that this was far more than a simple affair. The defendants didn't just want to steal Mr. Reeves' family, prosecutor Janet Kim had argued. They wanted to destroy his entire life. This was a calculated attack on everything he'd built, using his own daughter as a weapon. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours. Brooke was convicted on all charges: embezzlement, conspiracy, child endangerment, and fraud. Troy was convicted of medical malpractice, prescription fraud, child abuse, and conspiracy. Both faced sentences of 15 to 20 years in state prison. Vincent had watched Brooke's face as the verdict was read. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. The sophisticated professor who'd once mocked his blue-collar origins was facing the reality of spending the next 2 decades in a concrete cell. "I want to make a statement," Brooke had said as she was being led away. The judge had allowed it, probably out of curiosity more than legal necessity. "Vincent," Brooke had said, turning to look directly at him, "I know you think you've won, but Emma will never forgive you for this. She'll know you destroyed her mother. She'll know you put your pride above her happiness." Vincent had stood up, his presence filling the courtroom like a force of nature. "Emma will know that her mother tried to burn her alive to frame her father," he'd said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "She'll know that her mother was planning to steal her and disappear forever. She'll know that her mother chose a child abuser over her own family." He'd stepped closer to the defendant's table, his eyes locked on Brooke's face. "But most importantly, she'll know that her father never stopped fighting for her. She'll know that when the world tried to take her away from me, I moved heaven and earth to bring her home. She'll know that Vincent Reeves protects what's his, no matter what it costs." Brooke had started crying then, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd lost. She'd gambled everything on a man who'd been using her, and she'd lost her daughter, her freedom, and her future. Troy had been less dramatic. He'd simply stared at Vincent with the kind of hatred that could burn through steel. "This isn't over," he'd mouthed silently. Vincent had smiled and mouthed back, "Yes, it is." 2 weeks later, Vincent had been in his lawyer's office, signing the papers that would restore his full custody of Emma. The charges against him had been dropped, his reputation was being rehabilitated, and his daughter was coming home. "She's been through a lot," the social worker had warned. "She's going to need therapy, time to adjust, patience while she processes everything that's happened." Vincent had nodded, but he wasn't worried. Emma was his daughter, his blood, and she was stronger than anyone realized. She'd survived her mother's betrayal and her doctor's abuse. She'd come through this experience harder and wiser, just like her father had survived his own childhood trauma. The reunion had taken place in a sterile conference room at the Department of Children's Services. Emma had been quiet, cautious, her small hand gripping the social worker's arm as she'd entered the room. "Daddy," she'd whispered when she saw Vincent. "I'm here, baby girl," Vincent had said, kneeling down to her level. "I'm here, and I'm never going away again." Emma had run to him then, her small arms wrapping around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. Vincent had held her tight, feeling the last piece of his heart slide back into place. "I knew you'd come for me," Emma had whispered. I knew you wouldn't let them take me away. Vincent had carried his daughter out of that building and into his car, where Tommy had been waiting with a security detail. Vincent wasn't taking any chances with Emma's safety, not after what had happened. Where are we going? Emma had asked as they drove through Detroit. Home, Vincent had said. We're going home. But Vincent's definition of home had changed. The mansion in Bloomfield Hills was tainted now, filled with memories of betrayal and violence. Vincent had already purchased a new property, a fortress-like compound in the mountains of northern Michigan where he and Emma could start fresh. What about Mommy? Emma had asked. Vincent had looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. She was 8 years old, but she'd been through experiences that would break most adults. She deserved the truth, or at least as much truth as she could handle. Mommy made some very bad choices, he'd said carefully. She hurt people, and now she has to face the consequences. But you don't have to worry about that anymore. It's just you and me now, and I promise you'll always be safe. Emma had nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity of someone far older than her years. Will I ever see her again? She'd asked. Vincent had met her eyes in the mirror. That's up to you, sweetheart. When you're older, if you want to visit her, we can talk about it. But right now, you need to focus on getting better and being a kid again. The truth was more complex than Vincent could explain to an 8-year-old. He would never prevent Emma from seeing her mother if she truly wanted to, but he would make sure she understood exactly what Brooke had done before making that choice. Emma deserved to know that her mother had been willing to burn her alive for money and a man who'd been poisoning her. Chapter 7. The New Foundation. 6 months later, Vincent stood on the deck of his new home, watching Emma play in the snow with their German shepherd, Rex. The compound sat on 200 acres of pristine wilderness, completely self-sufficient and impenetrably secure. Vincent had designed every inch of it himself, from the reinforced walls to the underground bunker that could sustain them for months if necessary. Emma had adapted to their new life with surprising resilience. The nightmares had faded, her health had returned, and she'd begun to smile again. Vincent had hired the best tutors money could buy, and Emma was thriving academically. More importantly, she was learning the lessons that would serve her well in life. Trust carefully, forgive never, and always be prepared to fight for what's yours. Daddy, watch this, Emma called out, building an elaborate snow fortress with the kind of methodical precision that reminded Vincent of himself at that age. That's excellent engineering, Vincent called back. But remember, the strongest fortifications are the ones your enemies can't see. Emma nodded seriously, already incorporating hidden passages and concealed defenses into her design. She was learning to think like a Reeves, always 3 steps ahead, always prepared for betrayal. Vincent's phone buzzed with a message from Tommy. The cleanup operation was nearly complete. Troy's medical license had been permanently revoked, his assets seized, and his reputation destroyed beyond repair. He'd be eligible for parole in 12 years, assuming he survived that long. Prison was not kind to men who hurt children. Brooke's situation was more complicated. She'd been placed in protective custody after receiving death threats from other inmates who'd learned about her crimes against Emma. The woman who'd once looked down on Vincent's working-class background was now hiding from women who'd grown up on streets far tougher than any Vincent had known. Patricia Patterson had suffered her own form of punishment. The social humiliation had been so complete that she'd been forced to sell the Grosse Pointe mansion and move to a retirement community in Florida. The woman who'd called Vincent blue-collar trash was now living in a 1-bedroom apartment, sustained by Social Security and the grudging charity of distant relatives who were embarrassed by the family scandal. But Vincent's most satisfying victory was professional. Morrison Construction, the company that had been feeding information to Troy, had collapsed under the weight of their own greed. When Vincent's criminal charges were dropped and the truth about the conspiracy came out, Morrison's clients had fled en masse. The company that had tried to destroy Reeves' foundation was now being absorbed by Vincent at bankruptcy prices. Justice has a sense of irony, George Kellerman had observed when the deal was finalized. You're now worth more than you were before this whole thing started. Vincent had nodded, but money was no longer his primary motivation. Emma was his empire now, his legacy, his reason for building an unassailable fortress around their lives. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Detroit Metro Police. "Mr. Reeves, this is Detective Pappas. I have some news about Dr. Hendricks." Vincent felt his muscles tense. "What kind of news?" "He's dead. Killed in prison this morning. Looks like someone didn't appreciate his crimes against children." Vincent closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and regret. He would have preferred Troy to live with the consequences of his actions for decades. But prison justice had its own logic. "What about my wife?" Vincent asked. "Still alive, still in protective custody. Though I hear she's not doing well. Solitary confinement is hard on people who are used to social interaction." Vincent ended the call and looked back at Emma, who was putting the finishing touches on her snow fortress. His daughter was building something beautiful and strong, just like her father had taught her. The doorbell rang, an unusual sound in their remote location. Vincent's security system showed a familiar face at the gate. Riley, carrying what looked like official documents. "We have a problem," Riley said when Vincent let him in. "Troy had friends we didn't know about." Vincent poured himself a whiskey and waited for the explanation. "There's a group of doctors who've been running similar operations in different cities," Riley continued. "They've been sharing information, coordinating their activities, protecting each other. Troy's death has made them nervous." "How nervous?" "Nervous enough to start making moves against you. They think you're going to expose their entire network." Vincent set down his glass, feeling the familiar coldness settle in his chest. He thought the war was over, but apparently there were still enemies on the battlefield. "What kind of moves?" "Professional sabotage, media campaigns, maybe worse. These aren't just individual predators, Vince. This is an organized conspiracy, and they've been operating for years." Vincent looked out the window at Emma, who was now teaching Rex to navigate her obstacle course. His daughter was safe for now, but if these people were willing to hurt children to protect their secrets, nowhere would be truly secure. "How many of them are there?" "At least 6 that we can identify, probably more. They call themselves the Hippocratic Circle. They think they're above the law because they have medical degrees and social connections." Vincent felt his jaw clench. More predators. More people who thought they could hurt children and hide behind respectability. The kind of people who'd looked down on him his entire life, while committing crimes that would make street criminals blush. "What's their next move?" "They're going to try to discredit you. Make it look like you fabricated evidence against Troy. They have connections in law enforcement, media, academic institutions. They're going to paint you as an abusive husband who orchestrated an elaborate frame job." Vincent laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Let them try. I have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth. And more importantly, I have the willingness to do whatever it takes to protect my daughter." Vincent walked to his safe, retrieving files that contained everything Riley had discovered about the Hippocratic Circle. Names, addresses, financial records, victim testimonies. Enough evidence to destroy all of them. "They made one crucial mistake," Vincent said, spreading the documents across his desk. "They assumed I'd be satisfied with revenge against just Troy and Brooke. They didn't realize that Vincent Reeves doesn't just eliminate individual threats. He eliminates entire threat systems." Riley looked at the files, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're going to war with all of them." "I'm going to exterminate them," Vincent corrected. "Every single one of them, along with anyone who's helped them, protected them, or enabled them. When I'm finished, there won't be enough left of their organization to fill a medical waste bag." Vincent picked up his phone and called Tommy. It was time to expand the operation to show these predators what happened when they threatened Vincent Reeves' family. "Tommy, it's Vincent. We have more work to do." Chapter 8, The Network Burns. The Hippocratic Circle had made their first move 3 weeks later, and it was more sophisticated than Vincent had expected. They'd managed to get a sympathetic journalist to write an exposé questioning the evidence against Troy, suggesting that Vincent had manufactured the entire conspiracy to cover up his own abusive behavior. The article had appeared in a respected medical journal, written by Dr. Amanda Cross, a forensic psychologist who specialized in false accusation cases. She'd never interviewed Vincent, never examined the evidence, but she'd written a compelling piece about the dangers of accepting circumstantial evidence in high-profile cases. The pattern of evidence against Dr. Hendricks is suspiciously convenient, Cross had written. The timing, the witnesses, the financial records, all of it supports Mr. Reeves' narrative perfectly. Perhaps too perfectly. Vincent had read the article twice, admiring the craftsmanship even as he planned Cross's destruction. She'd been careful not to make any direct accusations, instead raising questions and suggesting alternative interpretations. It was the kind of academic hit job that could plant seeds of doubt without creating legal liability. But Vincent had been expecting this move. Riley's investigation had identified Cross as a key member of the Hippocratic Circle, a woman who specialized in discrediting victims and protecting predators through her academic credentials. She's done this before, Riley had reported. At least 8 cases over the past 5 years, always helping doctors accused of inappropriate behavior. She publishes papers questioning the victim's credibility, provides expert testimony for the defense, creates reasonable doubt where none should exist. Vincent's response had been swift and merciless. Tommy's team had begun documenting Cross's own history, discovering a pattern of academic fraud, research falsification, and financial corruption that stretched back to her graduate school days. She's been selling her testimony to the highest bidder, Tommy had reported. Different law firms, different medical boards, always for doctors accused of sexual misconduct. She's not a forensic psychologist. She's a professional character assassin. But Vincent hadn't been content with simple exposure. Cross had attacked his reputation, questioned his credibility, and by extension, threatened his safety. She needed to understand the consequences of making enemies with Vincent Reeves. The first strike had come through her university employer. Anonymous tips had led to an investigation of Cross's research grants, revealing systematic misappropriation of funds and falsification of data. Her published papers were being retracted, her tenure revoked, her career destroyed. The second strike had been personal. Cross's husband was a successful plastic surgeon with his own secrets, tax evasion, insurance fraud, sexual harassment of his staff. By the time Tommy's team was finished, both Cross and her husband were facing criminal charges. But Vincent's most devastating attack had targeted Cross's deepest vulnerability, her own daughter. The woman who'd made a career of discrediting abuse victims had been covering up her own husband's inappropriate behavior toward their teenage daughter. When that information became public, Cross had lost everything: her career, her family, and her credibility. She's finished, Riley had reported. Complete social and professional destruction. No one will ever take her seriously again. Vincent had felt the familiar satisfaction of a job well done, but this was only the beginning. Cross had been the most public member of the Hippocratic Circle, but she wasn't the most dangerous. Dr. Michael Sterling was the real power behind the organization. A prominent pediatric surgeon with connections throughout the medical establishment, Sterling had been coordinating the Circle's activities for over a decade. He was the one who identified vulnerable families, selected targets for his colleagues, and arranged the cover-ups when things went wrong. He's been running this like a criminal enterprise, Riley had discovered. Systematic targeting of single mothers, divorced women, anyone who might be isolated and vulnerable. His colleagues pay him a percentage of their take, whether that's money, sexual favors, or custody arrangements. Sterling had been more careful than his colleagues, never directly participating in the abuse, but always orchestrating it from behind the scenes. He'd built a network of corrupt social workers, compliant judges, and intimidated victims that had operated with impunity for years. Vincent had studied Sterling's operation with professional admiration. It was sophisticated, well-organized, and brutally effective. Sterling had built an empire of exploitation that would have impressed Vincent if it hadn't been targeting children. But empires could be toppled, and Vincent had been in the demolition business for decades. The attack on Sterling had begun with his finances. Tommy's team had discovered that Sterling had been using his medical practice to launder money from the Circle's activities. Payments from victims' families, insurance fraud, even human trafficking, all of it flowing through Sterling's accounts. He's got millions hidden in offshore accounts, Tommy had reported. Money from families who were blackmailed into silence, insurance companies that were defrauded, even some kind of adoption scheme where kids were being sold to wealthy families. Vincent had felt his anger crystallize into something cold and sharp. Sterling wasn't just abusing children. He was selling them. The man needed to be destroyed so completely that his name would become a cautionary tale. The financial investigation had led to criminal charges, but Vincent hadn't been satisfied with letting the legal system handle Sterling. Men like Sterling had connections, resources, ways of manipulating the system to avoid consequences. Vincent had decided to apply more direct pressure. Sterling lived in a fortress-like mansion in Birmingham, protected by security systems and private guards. He'd built his home like Vincent had built his, assuming that wealth and preparation could protect him from any threat. But Sterling had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated Vincent's willingness to cross lines that civilized people wouldn't cross. The attack had come at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when Sterling's guards were at their least alert. Tommy's team had disabled the security system, neutralized the guards, and gained access to Sterling's home study, where he'd been working late. Sterling had looked up from his computer to find Vincent sitting across from his desk, as calm and patient as death itself. "Mr. Reeves," Sterling had said, trying to maintain his composure. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," Vincent had replied. "But here we are." Sterling had reached for his phone, but Vincent had shaken his head. "Your security team is indisposed, and your phone won't work anyway. It's just you and me, Doctor. Time for a consultation." Chapter 9. The Final Reckoning. Vincent had spent 2 hours in Sterling's study, and when he'd left, the doctor had understood exactly what kind of man he'd been trying to destroy. Sterling had been given a choice: complete cooperation in dismantling the Hippocratic Circle, or complete destruction of everything he'd ever cared about. Sterling had chosen cooperation. Over the next month, Sterling had provided Vincent with everything: names, addresses, financial records, victim testimonies, evidence of crimes stretching back decades. The Hippocratic Circle had been larger and more corrupt than even Vincent had imagined, with tentacles reaching into law enforcement, judiciary, and child services. 23 doctors across 12 states, Riley had reported as they compiled Sterling's information. Over 400 victims that we can document, probably thousands more who were too scared to come forward. Vincent had looked at the scope of the conspiracy and felt something he rarely experienced: doubt. The organization was so large, so well-connected, that conventional approaches might not be sufficient. Some of these people had judges in their pockets, prosecutors on their payroll, entire police departments looking the other way. But Vincent had learned long ago that when conventional approaches failed, unconventional ones could succeed. "We're not going through the legal system," he told Tommy. "We're going to destroy them the same way they destroyed their victims, systematically, thoroughly, and without mercy." The campaign had taken 6 months to execute, but when it was finished, the Hippocratic Circle had ceased to exist. Some members had died in apparent accidents, car crashes, medical emergencies, tragic mishaps that befell people who hurt children. Others have been destroyed professionally and personally, their crimes exposed, their lives ruined, their futures erased. Dr. Sterling himself had suffered the most poetic fate. Vincent had arranged for him to be arrested at a medical conference in front of his peers, charged with operating a criminal conspiracy that had abused children for decades. The man who'd built his reputation on healing children had been exposed as their greatest predator. Sterling was currently serving a life sentence in maximum security prison, where child abusers received the kind of justice the legal system couldn't provide. Vincent received regular updates on Sterling's condition, and the reports indicated that prison life was proving educational for the former surgeon. The other members of the circle had met similar fates. Some were in prison, some were dead, some had simply disappeared, their lives erased as completely as they tried to erase their victims' trauma. Vincent had kept detailed records of everything, not out of sentimentality, but as insurance. If anyone ever questioned his methods or threatened his family again, they would understand exactly what Vincent Reeves was capable of doing to his enemies. But the most satisfying victory had been personal. Brooke had died in prison 6 months earlier, killed by an inmate who'd learned about her crimes against Emma. The woman who'd once mocked Vincent's background had discovered that prison justice was far more brutal than anything she'd experienced in her privileged world. Vincent hadn't felt sadness at Brooke's death, only a sense of completion. Emma would never have to worry about her mother trying to reclaim custody or manipulate her emotions. The threat was eliminated permanently. Patricia Patterson had died of a heart attack 2 weeks after learning of her daughter's death. The woman who'd called Vincent blue-collar trash had died alone in a Florida retirement home, mourned by no one and remembered by few. Vincent had attended neither funeral. Now, standing on his deck watching Emma practice martial arts with her instructor, Vincent felt the satisfaction of a job completed perfectly. Emma was 13 now, healthy and strong, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing her father would move heaven and earth to protect her. She'd never asked about visiting her mother, never expressed curiosity about the trial or its aftermath. Emma understood, with the wisdom of someone who'd survived trauma, that some people were simply toxic and needed to be eliminated from your life. "Daddy, watch this combination," Emma called out, demonstrating a series of moves that would drop most adult attackers. "Excellent form," Vincent replied. "But remember, the most important rule, never fight fair," Emma answered. "If someone's trying to hurt you, do whatever it takes to stop them." Vincent smiled. Emma had learned the lessons that would serve her well in life. Trust carefully, forgive never, and always be prepared to destroy your enemies completely. His phone buzzed with a message from Riley. A new case, a different kind of predator, someone who thought they were smart enough to hurt children and escape consequences. Vincent deleted the message without reading the details. He'd built his empire, protected his daughter, and eliminated his enemies. The war was over, and Vincent Reeves had won completely. Emma finished her training session and walked over to him, her face flushed with exertion and accomplishment. "I love you, Daddy," she said, hugging him tightly. "I love you too, sweetheart," Vincent replied, holding his daughter close. "And I always will." Vincent looked out at the mountains surrounding their compound, their fortress against a world full of people who would hurt innocents if given the chance. He'd built something unbreakable here, something that would protect Emma for the rest of her life. The weak didn't survive in Vincent's world. The disloyal were eliminated. The threatening were destroyed. But the loyal, the strong, the worthy, they were protected with every resource at Vincent's disposal. Emma was his greatest achievement, his most important construction project, his legacy that would outlast any building he'd ever erected. She would grow up knowing that her father had never failed her, never abandoned her, never forgiven those who tried to take her away. Some might call Vincent's methods extreme, but Vincent had learned long ago that half measures led to half victories. When someone threatened Vincent Reeves' family, they learned what total defeat looked like. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Vincent put his arm around Emma's shoulders and led her inside their fortress, where dinner was waiting and the future was secure. Vincent Reeves had won, completely, permanently, and without mercy, and he would never apologize for protecting what was his. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.